Collaboration Program field-wide webinar on building partnerships between prosecutors and mental health clinicians. To allow for additional sign-ins past the hour, we will be starting this webinar in a few minutes. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program field-wide webinar on building partnerships between prosecutors and mental health clinicians. My name is Ethan Kelly, and I am a Senior Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I will be moderating today's webinar, which is hosted by the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, BJA, and the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Next slide. To give you an overview of today's webinar, first we will do introductions of our speakers and organizations. Then we will discuss interdisciplinary practice for mental health in the law. Then our two guest speakers today will discuss their on-the-ground efforts building partnerships between prosecutors and mental health professionals to improve responses for people with mental health and co-occurring disorders. And toward the end of the webinar, we'll have time for questions and answers. A few housekeeping items. Anytime during the webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. This includes both technical and content-related questions. We will try to reply to technical questions in the chat window as we go. For the content-related questions, we will keep a running list and address them at the end of the webinar. We will do our best to get through as many questions as possible. If you encounter technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues that you may not be able to resolve. We are recording the webinar and it will be available on the CSG website within 1 to 2 weeks. Next slide. For today's speakers, Kelly Boyers, supervising attorney for the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. Kelly has been a prosecutor for over 13 years with the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office and is the supervisor of central operations. She helped create and secure funding for the pilot that led to the rapid diversion program in Los Angeles County. She has extensive experience working in all aspects of prosecution and believes that all three prongs of prosecution should be weighed and considering with every case. Her views are rooted in her background growing up in a disadvantaged community in Detroit, Michigan, and mental illness and drug addiction in her family. Reverend Charlene Hughes is the lead community outreach manager at the St. Louis County Prosecutor's Office. She has a Bachelor of Social Work with a minor in psychology, including an emphasis on trauma, as well as her master's in social work and certified in nonprofit leadership and management from the University of Missouri in St. Louis. Her work as a community leader and advocate for more than 30 years has focused on issues related to gender responsiveness, people experiencing homelessness, people with mental health conditions, and bridging the gaps between law enforcement and community members by creating a nonprofit between law enforcement and prosecutors called Humanity in the Middle. Rebecca Neville is a staff attorney at the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. Prior to joining APA, she worked in private practice as a prosecutor at the state's attorney's office in Prince George's County, Maryland, specializing in domestic and sexual violence crimes. She received her master's in social work and law degree from the Catholic University of America. Thanks to you all for joining the webinar today. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you some background on the Council of State Governments Justice Center. The Justice Center is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that combines the power of a membership association representing state officials in all three branches of government with the expertise of a policy and research team focused on assisting others to attain measurable results. Our staff develops research-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. Next slide, please. As an organization, we focus on a range of areas within the justice system. We pride ourselves in having a deep understanding of the experiences of people at the front line of the justice system and our ability to gather people from both sides of the aisle and across the country to foster collaboration. We promote smart and effective policy and practice changes through in-depth analysis, on-the-ground training, and direct assistance to local and state governments, as well as dissemination of best practices and research. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about our goals. Looking to break and reduce the cycle of incarceration. Working across systems to improve health, opportunity, and equity. And working with leaders to help leaders expand what works to improve safety in their communities. Next slide, please. This is the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program. JMHCP promotes innovative cross-system collaboration and provides grants directly to states, local governments, and federally recognized Indian tribes. It is designed to improve responses to people with mental illnesses and substance use disorders who are involved in the criminal justice system. Next slide, please. We do this work with funding through the Bureau of Justice Assistance and the Office of Justice Programs, which we would like to tell you about. At BJA, the mission is to provide leadership and assistance to local criminal justice programs that improves and reinforce the nation's criminal justice system. BJA's goals are to reduce and prevent crime, violence, and drug abuse, and to improve the way in which the criminal justice system functions. In order to achieve such goals, BJA programs illustrate the coordination and cooperation of local, state, and federal governments. BJA works closely with programs that bolster law enforcement operations, expand drug courts, and provide benefits to safety officers. Please visit the BJA website to learn more. Next slide, please. The Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, APA, is a national nonprofit whose mission is to support and enhance the effectiveness of prosecutors in their mission to create safer communities. Through publications, training, and technical assistance, and legislative analysis, we serve as a forum for collaborating with criminal justice partners across the globe and to advocate on behalf of prosecutors on emerging issues related to the administration of justice. Next slide, please. Now I would like to turn it over to Rebecca Neville from APA to talk about interdisciplinary practice and mental health.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ethan. On behalf of APA, I want to extend my thanks to the Council of State Governments Justice Center and BJA for organizing and hosting this webinar, and the many people who've worked so hard to make it possible and develop the content. I want to also extend our thanks to the two panelists joining us today and our attendees who are taking time out of your busy schedules to provide your expertise and experiences in this interdisciplinary practice in the criminal justice field. I do want to preface this presentation with the fact that when we say clinicians, we'll be saying clinicians a lot throughout this program. And in the context of this presentation, we are mainly referring to social workers and clinical social workers. And so with that, we'll move on to the next portion of our presentation, which will be consideration for interdisciplinary practice, mental health, and the law. So there's been a boom in recent years, a growing number of mental health calls and involvement in mental health illness in the criminal justice sphere, and a growing knowledge that we need to recognize and address the growing mental health crisis in the criminal justice system. You can see from the data that one Florida county found that in 1 in 10 calls for service involved a person with a severe mental illness. And in Madison, Wisconsin, the behavioral health calls for service take twice as long to resolve as non-behavioral health related calls. So, behavioral health related calls take about 3 hours on average, and all other calls take law enforcement roughly on average about 1.5 hours to resolve, which just shows you how intensive the contacts and how often the contacts are for people who have a mental illness or experiencing a mental health crisis, that their involvement is, and just the contact with the with the criminal justice system. We could go on to the next slide. You'll see that these calls for service and those that are coming into contact with law enforcement do correlate with what who ends up in jails and in prisons and end up in custody, and therefore who comes across the desk of a prosecutor. So for a study by the Department of Justice that was released in 2017, studied the mental health status of people in custody in jails and prisons in 2011-2012, and showed that more people in prisons and jails met the threshold for a serious psychological distress in the past 30 days than the standardized general population. That being roughly in prison and jails, respectively 14% and 26%, with the general population at a mere 5%. And what was surprising was the specialized knowledge they learned about population. So a larger percent of women in prison or jail, roughly 20% and 32% respectively, than men in prison or jail at 14% and 26% respectively, met the threshold for SPD in the past 30 days. And people that were incarcerated for a violent crime, the 17%, were as likely as those incarcerated for a property crime to have met the threshold for SPD in the past 30 days. So it's important when you're thinking about how to partner clinicians and prosecutors or the criminal justice stakeholders to really think about what populations you'll be affecting. How should you organize them, and who are we looking to impact? We could go to the next slide. What is an interdisciplinary practice approach? A general definition from a 1998 study defined interdisciplinary collaboration pretty broadly is an interpersonal process through which members of different disciplines contribute to a common product or goal. And in 2003, it was more specifically defined by Laura Bronstein as an effective interpersonal process that facilitates the achievement of goals that cannot be reached when individual professionals act on their own. And these definitions really highlight that in the criminal justice sphere, these two discrete professions bring expertise together in order to achieve a singular goal that they could not do if they were within their own circles of professionals or within their own offices. And it's important because it involves the word process. So we must continue to be sharing and learning from each other. And so even in a prosecutor's office, if that's where the clinicians are, if they are siloed or operate on separate in separate offices, the process for communication facilitation of that goal will break down. And any attempted program or effort at a mental health collaboration would not be as successful. And I think many people overlook this part. They think it's just a definition. We can bring professionals together and a program will just come out of that process. But a program will work only if without the proper framing for that process, the collaboration will be hindered and really not as successful as it could be. All right, next, if we can move to the next slide. So there are considerations for interdisciplinary practice, both when you're entering into just interdisciplinary work and evaluating it as you're ongoing, making sure that it's working, resolving any issues. So historically, clinicians have served on a multidisciplinary team, such as forensic interviewers on child abuse cases, or they have specified roles with very specific obligations, such as victim and witness advocates or coordinators, or strictly assigned to referring victims to services or assisting prosecutors in talking to victims. However, recent criminal justice reform efforts have renewed consideration of the clinician's role in the criminal justice arena in both prosecution and law enforcement. And you can see from the statistics, we looked over how many people with a mental health diagnosis or an SPD have contacts with the criminal justice system and come across the desk of a prosecutor. So many jurisdictions, clinicians have been given this dramatic shift to lead this conversation. And I don't want to overlook the work that many jurisdictions have done that have attempted these policies and programs or had them in place for a long time. But nationwide, clinicians are really starting to take on a larger collaborative role. And what does that look like? Jurisdictions are instituting and considering mental health response unit, mobile crisis units in place of or along with police departments. They're considering clinicians to be diversion program leaders or to lead community engagement efforts. And these roles can be in addition to or along with as additional staff to victim and witness assistance efforts and referrals. And these are just a few of the ways that clinicians and prosecutors and law enforcement have enhanced this interdisciplinary practice approach that shows promise and a more holistic response to crime overall. And while some data and programs are new, they are really showing promise. For example, in South Carolina, their new reentry program has really reduced their recidivism rate. The bringing in clinicians and really working with people as they re-enter society has showed to reduce their recidivism rate. So these new roles for clinicians, partnering with prosecutors, partnering in the criminal justice sphere, seem to be showing that a more holistic approach is more effective. We could go to the next slide. Thank you so much. And so when you're talking about successful interdisciplinary practice, one important consideration from the outset is acknowledging cultural differences. Prosecutors and clinicians have discrete sets of regulations, licensing requirements, and goals, professional goals that can lead to difficulties in collaboration if they're not acknowledged and mutually respected. So just some basic cultural differences include the goals in professions. Prosecutors, for example, have the goal of achieving justice for involved parties and the community. There's not one specific client. Many people think, that prosecutors just want to seek punishment for a crime. And sometimes in more serious violent crimes, this can be the case, but really in a prosecutorial setting, the goal is to obtain justice for the victim and community. We represent the people or the state. There's no singular client. So whether that's in the form of a trial, a dismissal, a plea, or even referral to a type of diversion program. In clinical settings, the NASW, the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, highlights that a clinician's goal is the individual client and human well-being to meet the basic needs of all people, particularly those marginalized and underserved communities. And so certainly there are macro perspective social workers who do research on the criminal justice system, but specifically in a clinical setting, You're looking at an individual client and really assessing that client. And also the focus of the setting is different. So in a prosecutorial setting, you have the focus being on the criminal act. You have a case, you get a case file. We are recognized that good people can do bad things. And what is justice for that act that took place that we consider a crime? They look at the evidence for that crime, that act that took place, determine if there's evidence that can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and seek justice, whatever that looks like. Clinicians, on the other hand, are trained to look at clients from a more holistic perspective, taking into account their environment, their background, the client's relationships specifically. The perspective of clinicians is really to gather information, look past a singular act, or determine the cause or history behind a client's behavior or mental illness that brought them to seek treatment. And this is particularly for defendants. So in prosecution, you have an inherently adversarial process, the prosecution versus the defense, and the ability for prosecutors to really take a holistic perspective look at defendants is inhibited. And the third is the different ethical standards. The third is being different ethical standards and duties. So prosecutors, for example, have a duty of candor to the court, and under Brady, they're required to provide any exculpatory evidence to the defense. But on the other hand, clinicians have a duty of confidentiality and the right to a clinician-client privilege. In many jurisdictions, this is statutorily protected. The Supreme Court, in the case of Jaffe versus Redmond in 5 U.S. 1 in 1996, recognizing that many state laws do include social workers, specifically extended the federal psychotherapist client privilege to licensed clinical social workers. So unlike prosecutors, clinicians have this right to confidentiality. And this actually may be the hardest cultural difference to overcome. There's an inherent conflict of interest that comes from working in a prosecutor's office as a clinician, because there isn't a duty of confidentiality that conflicts with some of your training. And I experienced this personally as a victim witness coordinator in DC Superior Court when I worked there, and as a prosecutor, you as a clinician have to say what you tell me to a victim, to a witness, is not confidential. And the final one being the driver of decisions. So the law in a prosecutorial settings is what drives the decisions, and the prosecutor is most often the sole decision maker, looking at the evidence, talking to the victim, looking at the law, and makes the decisions. Conversely, the person-centered decisions are in a clinical setting. So the typical saying in a clinical sphere is to meet the client where they are, in the sense that you're not forcing change or forcing decisions upon them unless there is a mental health crisis or a safety concern and a duty to warn. So social workers are really trained to evaluate, guide, provide opportunities for growth, and respect the agency of the individual and the client's decisions. And this seems like a lot of cultural differences, but if acknowledged and respected, there can be so many benefits of the interdisciplinary collaboration between clinicians and prosecutors. If we could go to the next slide. So just to name a few, there can be program development that reduces involvement in the criminal justice system. And this can be both individually with what many prosecutors term a frequent flyer defendant who has a high recidivism rate. If you're looking to determine if it's caused by a mental health illness or issue, or if you're trying to look to reduce racial disparities in your jurisdiction and reduce an entire population's level of contact with the criminal justice system, clinicians can inform the development of diversion, reentry programs, victim programs to reduce trauma and interrupt the cycle of violence. By sharing their expertise and the expertise of prosecutors, sharing their case data and information, this interdisciplinary practice allows both sets of professionals to really evaluate the causes and effects and the level of mental illness in their community and develop more effective and more meaningful programs in their community. Additionally, clinicians and prosecutors collaborating increases the education understanding within the justice system of mental health issues and social justice issues. So with different perspectives, each discipline often has particularized knowledge that can be beneficial to the other. Prosecutors can learn more about the presentation of certain mental illnesses, mental health crises, and better scrutinize cases that come across their desk. Whereas, on the other hand, clinicians can gain an understanding of the standards of proof, the statutory requirements necessary to prove a certain case. And that can inform their conversations if someone discloses a certain crime to them, and not that they should be offering legal advice, but it can help frame when they're going to be talking to a prosecutor. When we're sharing this knowledge, we're able to inform our own circles and our own work with a wider lens. And third, the interdisciplinary collaborations can certainly provide insight into employee wellness and reduce burnout. These two professions are distinct in their level of compassion fatigue and burnout, particularly since the onset of COVID-19 and courthouse closures and remote work. Many people often don't think that prosecutors can have something like vicarious trauma, and I think prosecutors aren't trained to look at it themselves. But particularly in units where day in and day out, you're dealing with child abuse, looking at pictures of abuse, or speaking with family members of murder victims, you want to address the mental health of employees. And this has been known, studied, respected in clinical settings for so long. There's a wealth of knowledge out there about compassion fatigue, about self-care, and it's there for prosecutor officers to draw on in order to research and address the wellness of their employees at every level. We could go to the next slide. So we've talked about the differences between these professions and the benefits of their collaboration. So looking at the elements, what makes up a successful collaboration. So you have cross-discipline and collaborative trainings, whether a clinician is embedded in a prosecutor's office or not, making sure that there's opportunities for each professional working in that space to be educated together on the regulations, perspectives, and ethical considerations of the other in the same setting. In the same setting can also clear up any misunderstandings or answer questions immediately between the professions and make sure everyone's on the same page moving forward. And one example I think of is resolving the difference in language. Prosecutors and clinicians often have the same words and use them, but they attach different meanings to those words because of their different trainings and cultural differences. For instance, community engagement, what that means to prosecutors may not be the same as what it means to clinicians. Being able to sit down and train on what real community engagement looks like can reduce frustration and make sure everyone's on the same page moving forward. And so clear protocols that outline each discipline's role and responsibilities, where this clinician will be, whether it's victim assistance, are they going to be doing that diversion program development, ensuring compliance, or are you looking at embedding a clinician in a courtroom to evaluate defendants? All of those jobs are roles that clinicians can play, but defining that role early will inform every facet of the collaboration, from who the clinician can interact with to something as simple as where they will be housed in the office or in the courthouse. And that's because it's based on the role of the clinician in the collaboration. So you have to work through the resolution of cultural differences, conflicts of interest that the social worker has and the clinician has, and the hesitation that any of the community members have interacting with law enforcement or the prosecutor's office to really think about what that role should be. And then shared mission and mutual respect from the outset of collaboration. If there's not a shared mission and mutual respect between the professions, the collaboration will necessarily fail. A shared mission can be as simple as to reduce the number of mentally ill individuals incarcerated, or to secure treatment for them rather than incarceration, to make sure we're diverting appropriate cases. For example, when you're developing a mental health court, what is the mission of the mental health court for all involved parties? And if everyone is on the same page, that likelihood of success increases significantly. So it may sound elementary, but really being clear on the mission before the collaboration begins is imperative. Write it out, put it in a training manual, make it clear, thoroughly establishing that attainable goal so that each professional has that in mind when working together and conflicts arise, can really make sure that the work goes smoothly. And that's why mutual respect is in the same vein, which leads to the final point, creating frequent formal and informal opportunities for communication, which really ties all three of the ones I just talked about together. So formal trainings and clear protocols allow for roles to be defined and a policy to be put in place for how to resolve conflict between a prosecutor and clinician if they have different recommendations or different thoughts on how a case should move forward. But those informal spaces are just as important. They offer the chance for people to share perspectives, learn about the individual outside of their professional role, and really increase that feeling of teamwork that gets to the heart of building respect and mutual respect for each other and each other's decisions. So when you get to know that prosecutor, you get to know that clinician, when you disagree on a case or a conflict arises, you know it's about that they're really working together. You are both working together and simply have a different perspective, but can still respect each other's decisions. If we could go to the next slide. So now that we've talked about what an interdisciplinary practice approach is, its benefits and elements, we could really talk about what an organization needs to look at, consider, or do in order to be ready. If you've decided to bring on clinicians in a way in your criminal justice jurisdiction, what does your organization need to do? So if we could go to the next slide. I want to start off with the reality that many people consider that in a prosecutorial setting, their abilities are limited by budgetary concerns and a fiscal responsibility and obligations. So the considerations that we're going to talk about are likely impacted by a particular office's resources, but there are certainly many unique opportunities out there, particularly recently. You know, if it's through your annual budget, finding a grant program, partnering with a local university or law school to find people to help with some of the back work. There can really be unique ways to fund a different program. So you want to look at the number of clinicians. How many prosecutors are you assigning to a single clinician, or how many will be in a specific unit? If they're not going to be in the prosecutor's office, how many cases is your jurisdiction seeing? How many cases coming across have a mental health diagnosis? You need to do the research first in order to determine what number of clinicians is important and going to be key. One suggestion is to host a listening session in each unit or with certain prosecutors or staff to provide insight into how many clinicians could be used or needed, or how to allocate them when they are hired. If one unit doesn't feel they need or see mental health cases, does another unit really have an uptick in mental health illnesses that they're seeing? So really doing the groundwork first to determine where the need is and how many will be needed. And then where will the clinicians be housed? Does it make sense to have them in units, in their own individual offices, or even in the courtroom? Should there be a standalone building, such as a siloed diversion program? In Prince George's County, where I worked, the Family Justice Center was in the courthouse parking lot, kept the victims or witnesses outside of a prosecutorial setting that was very adversarial, but when they needed to be referred to services or they just walked into a court appearance, they didn't have to go far. We could send them right across the parking lot to get connected to services, or have information on diversion programs. And so it really that consideration of where is their space. When a clinician, and this actually really plays a large part in how a clinician is viewed by the community members. So when a clinician comes from, where a clinician comes from determines whether trust can be built between the community members and the organization. There's inherently in our recent times the distrust of law enforcement or prosecutors. So being able to bridge that gap, finding ways to bridge that gap can really, and finding a proper setting for a clinician can really make and enhance the success of a program. And finally, and sometimes the most difficult, is securing buy-in from practitioners and prosecutors. I think there's a hunger right now for getting more clinicians involved in the mental health crisis in the criminal justice system, but ensuring buy-in can be explaining the role of clinicians prior to placement, and that means where they're going to be. So if they're going to be in the prosecutor's office, making sure every staff, every prosecutor, every executive level individual is aware of who they'll be, what they're going to be doing. And if they're in the courtroom, as long as the court clerk, the judge, everyone is trained and explained the role of the clinician prior to their coming on. And one method is to lean on and really ensure prosecutor allies in each unit that will be impacted, or each court that will be impacted. This is usually, but not always, those with a social services background, but you can really engage them, explain the program, discuss the benefits of interdisciplinary practice, and they can then in turn discuss it with their colleagues before a formal training. So that's, again, building on that informal opportunity on top of the formal opportunity. And if we could go to the next slide. So these are just, when you're getting organizational readiness in a prosecutorial setting, just some important considerations that we've talked about for integrating the clinician's role. Is really, you have your victim assistance that the clinician will do. You can have diversion program compliance. There is courtroom, if they're going to be providing defendants, courtroom assistance to defendants, or if they're going to be guiding charging decisions or case screenings. If you're implementing a diversion program and you don't have prosecutors sufficient to review cases for possible mental health illnesses, can some clinicians be involved? Is that an appropriate role for a clinician to be playing? So there's different ways that you can organize and really think through what a clinician will be doing in your office or really in your larger criminal justice arena to gather this information and decide what the clinician's role will be. Thank you so much. And now at this time for a look at our two programs to really highlight some of these elements of a successful collaboration between mental health clinicians and prosecutors that are going on around the country. I would like to turn it over to our two panelists. So first we'll hear from Kelly Boyer from LA City.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I wanted to start by saying I like a lot of the things that Rebecca spoke about in terms of the holistic approach, especially. And that's what our program that I'm going to discuss with you now is really based on. We have in Los Angeles City, we have, especially in the Central Division where I am the supervisor, we have a tremendous homeless population, upwards of 30,000 at the last census count in just our division. We also have in that population tons of mentally ill folks walking around. So we get a lot of cases of random slaps, things where people aren't hurt, random people getting spit on. And we get those type of cases all the way up to very serious misdemeanors that in other counties would probably be felonies. But where we can, we try to take a holistic approach to these cases. In addition, before I get into the program and our data, the last study done by the LA County Jail here, they estimated a recidivism rate among their mentally ill population upwards of 90%. So when we're looking at working with the homeless population, mentally ill population, we have to keep that in mind and know that they may not work. It may not work the first time or the second time, but maybe that third time they will be willing to accept services and be successful in the program. We've had several people drop out of our program, fall off, and then come back to court ready to work on their issues, ready to get treatment, and they end up successfully graduating the program, getting housing. Sometimes they get degrees, and oftentimes they get employment by the end of the program. So I'll jump right in. In California, there was a penal code section passed. I'm sorry, a bill was passed that was written by a Los Angeles County Public Defender, Nick Stewart Oden. He wrote a mental health diversion bill and took it all the way up the legislature, and it was adopted and codified in Penal Code Section 1001.35 to 1001.36. And so this mental health diversion can be granted over the people's objection. And I just want to say, as Rebecca was talking about, these informal discussions and informal education opportunities are very important. We have a lot of prosecutors and even defense attorneys who don't understand the role mental health plays in a lot of criminal conduct. And so that's why that portion was written into the bill, because the public defenders have been around dealing with these issues, and they know that sometimes a prosecutor may not understand all of the issues surrounding mental health and how the person can be treated and get better. So for these cases to qualify, there's a couple of different elements. So a qualified expert needs to assess the defendant and represent that he suffers from one of the disorders in the DSM. There are some exclusions, which you can see on the screen. A big part of it is that the defendant's disorder was a significant factor in the charged conduct. The clinician also has to represent that the defendant would actually respond to treatment and he can be safely treated in the community. He then also has to consent to diversion and agree to comply with the terms of diversion. And the final factor is that he does not pose a significant danger to public safety. Now, this is not something that can be argued based on the conduct of the current crime, but there are charges defined in our penal code that are listed in this section as what it means to pose significant danger to public safety. But you can always argue that factor. Now, you'll see in this code, there's a lot of steps that require a clinician to do the assessment. So for LA County, I'm sure it's like this in tons of other places. It takes a very long time to get the approval for the public defender to get the approval for an expert to be appointed, and for that expert to diagnose the defendant, make the report, and also find treatment for the person in a program. So with that in mind, our pilot was created, which we'll get into. Next slide, please. First, we'll talk briefly. So if the person successfully completes the diversion, then his case is dismissed and his record of arrest is sealed. Of course, we have to have a long-term care plan in place. The defendant's record does contain information, though, that's always accessible to the court and law enforcement on their rap sheet. And if the defendant fails the diversion, the criminal proceedings are reinstated. Next slide, please. So our pilot started with a grant from the MacArthur Foundation under the Safety and Justice Challenge. So in our office, I proposed that we embed clinicians, licensed clinical social workers, case managers, and service providers and/or navigators in the courtroom and do on-the-spot assessments. This was prior to the mental health diversion bill passing, but with that bill passing, it really gave our proposal teeth to get people rapidly out of custody. For misdemeanors, people really don't want to stay in custody long to try to find a program, and they don't want to be bothered with coming back to court several times to try to get assessed and find a program. So we felt it was very important to embed our social workers in the court so that these things could be done instantaneously on the spot. A big part of our social workers is that they're connected and funded through the public defender's office. They're funded through their grant, but everything's done through the public defender's office. The reason this is important, especially with the mentally ill population, is a lot of times they don't even trust their attorney. So it's really hard for them to trust clinicians, especially if they're hired by the prosecution. But we do have a huge collaboration with them. Just because they're not in our office or embedded in our office, there is still a strong relationship and a huge collaboration. And for the program to be successful, we have a big collaboration between the court, the city attorneys, the public defender, the LA County Department of Mental Health, the LA County Sheriff's Department, and Project 180 is one of our treatment providers that started with the pilot, and they're just amazing. So again, like I discussed, because of the limited resources and the wait time that we were experiencing to try to get defendants matched up with mental health treatment services, we wanted to embed the social workers directly in the court to do this on-site assessment. Next slide, please. So this is the process. I won't go over in grave detail every single step, but you can take a look at the screen and you'll see the basic overview is that the public defender looks at every case and tries to pick out those cases where you can tell by the conduct that there's a mental health disorder, or you can tell, or there's an admission of a mental health disorder, or our mental health evaluation team under LAPD is called out. You could tell that by their rap sheets. Sometimes they have holds, mental health holds, or they've been to mental health treatment criminally insane mental health treatment facilities. So they look for those, and once they find someone who does have a mental health disorder, they interview that client to see if they qualify for the diversion. And if they do, they're passed on to our embedded clinician, who does an on-site interview and assessment and prepares a short report that's then passed on to the case manager, who immediately matches the person with services and gets them placed right away. Next slide, please. It's been a joint recommendation for our program. It was very important that it's not an adversarial process, so that we move through it quickly. So we both recommend the person for this mental health diversion, and we use the rapid diversion form, which is the form filled out by the clinician in court. And then once they get to the program, they do a more thorough evaluation and assessment and add additional services as needed. An important aspect of this is that the case manager meets with the participant on a weekly basis, and they check in with the program. A lot of times, some of our defendants will leave their programs because they're either being mistreated, it's dirty, they're not providing meals, there's all sorts of things. So it's very important that the case manager checks in with the participant on a weekly basis and make sure they're doing okay with the program. And they're always told that if they leave the program, come immediately to court as soon as court is open the next opportunity, so that you can get replaced in a different program if there's a problem with that program. And we make sure to have monthly progress reports. And the research shows, and our program has shown, that when defendants get before a judge and a judge is encouraging them and telling them the terms of the program and encouraging them to continue on, that we have a higher success rate. And we've also seen that in our program. Next slide, please. So these are just some brief numbers, and this is why I mentioned the upwards of 90% recidivism among the mentally ill population. So you can see the arrest rate went down drastically, the recidivism rate for our participants, and you have to look at it in perspective, given that the original rate is 90%. So it's all in perspective when you look at the numbers. Like I said, with the mentally ill population, as with drug offenders and other specialized people that need specialized treatment, it may not work the first time, but it may work the second time or third time. They may be ready and in a place to accept the treatment. Next slide, please. Okay, and the success of the program, like I said, it depends on a huge collaboration effort between the court, the defense counsel, and the prosecutors. So it really is important to select people from each office who can work collaboratively. We all have different prosecutors in our office that have different specialties. And so it's important to pick that person who does understand the rehabilitation prong of prosecution and the importance of incorporating treatment and everything into the program, and who's able to work with the defense bar and the judges in a respectful manner. It's important that it's not an adversarial process, so that everyone's honest and open with each other. We have a great relationship with the public defenders and also the service providers, the clinicians, as well as the case managers. And you want to keep excellent service providers who keep the lines of communication flowing. And that should really say excellent people on each team. So excellent people from the defense bar, excellent prosecutors, excellent judges, and excellent clinicians and case managers that keep the lines of communication flowing, so that there's trust between the groups, and we're able to work together and trust each other when there's a recommendation. We can trust the public defender who's assigned to evaluating the cases. We all have the same goal in mind. We want the program to be successful. So they won't recommend someone who they don't think will be successful in the program. And they won't recommend someone for our specific program who is a danger or the conduct is really egregious. We are pretty much on the same page with that for the pilot, although the diversion itself is really broad and it includes a lot of the different cases we talked about. That usually goes through a hearing and it's a more adversarial process. But for the people that really need help and the conduct that we can fast track through the system, we utilize that system a lot and try to get people the help they need. I believe that's the last slide. And that's all I have.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. I know that that program is so unique and you really spearheaded such a wonderful rapid diversion program. So just thank you so much for your presentation and your efforts. And now we'll hear from Reverend Charlene Hughes about her lead program in St. Louis.
Thank you very much, Rebecca and Kelly. The information that you all have shared has been great, and it gives me hope for our program here in St. Louis since we are currently creating it. So we are currently developing a law enforcement assisted diversion program, short LEAD, and it is a harm reduction model based on Prosecuting Attorney Bell's platform. We want to make sure that there is less justice involvement and that people who happen to be suffering from OUD don't necessarily end up in that spinning wheel, charge after charge after charge after charge, which we all know negatively impacts their future and their present. Just a little background on LEAD. It was developed and launched in 2011 in Seattle, Washington. Harm reduction approach to responding to low-level non-violent offenses, i.e. drug possession, sales, and sex work. This particular approach moves away from the previous approaches of war on drugs, which we know did not actually do anything, really. It was very, very unsuccessful. What I love about this program is that it's pre-arrest. And we collaborate with law enforcement officers because officers know who they deal with and who they service in communities. So the only way this and other LEAD programs are going to be successful is to work with the officers who are in the community. So it is community-based, community-driven, and we're all about harm reduction interventions. Next slide. So currently here in St. Louis County, as I said, we are taking the bull by its horn. We do understand that community-based diversion ultimately is the goal, because we have to find out what's going on with the person and the environment that they're in to see if we can help them be the best that they can be. So again, our goal is to change how we respond to safety, disorder, and health-related problems. Improving public safety and public health is really number one here in the St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. Health-oriented and harm reduction interventions are how we go about this. And we use research to make sure that how we're approaching things is really what works. We want to reduce the number of people entering the criminal justice system again. Once you're in, you're in. It's hard to get out. Undo racial disparities at the front end of the criminal justice system. Now, this is a big one because we all know across the board, the racial disparities are growing every single day. But the good thing is that there are offices like myself and Los Angeles and some other places that are working very, very hard to shrink that gap. We all know that about $40,000 is spent a year housing someone who's been or allegedly committed a crime. But if we can prevent that, that $40,000 can go back into sustaining funding for alternative interventions like these diversion programs that are being birthed and utilized across the country. And when you do things like the LEAD program and other diversion programs, it strengthens the relationship between law enforcement and the community, because the community realizes that law enforcement is not just punitive. They're there, they care about the human being. Next slide. So our process is simple. Law enforcement comes in contact with the community member. Based on their discretion or their knowledge of that community and that person, they determine their eligibility. And a person to be referred to the LEAD program has to be at least 18 years of age. Again, low level, non-violent, non-sexual, drug-related felonies. However, we're kind of in a particularly different position here in St. Louis County because there are 93 municipalities. So most often when things happen in the municipalities, they are misdemeanors, which we have no jurisdiction on it. But if there's a felony associated with a misdemeanor that happens to be drug related, then the officer can refer the person to us. Once the LEO or law enforcement officer determines a person's eligibility, we have a 1-800 number that they call. A certified peer specialist will meet the officer, do a warm handoff, and assess the immediate needs of the person in question. So that means housing, food, clothing, and we have resources that can take care of those immediate needs. But that certified peer specialist also schedules an appointment with one of the case managers here in the office. That's myself and 2 other people. Then we do a full biopsychosocial assessment. So we can see the whole picture of the person and then utilize the resources and the networks that we've built to make sure that each and every part of the person is addressed. Because again, we want to make sure that we're meeting them where they are and able to help them self-determine and get to their next level. We check in, maybe not weekly, but we must check in 30, 60, 90 days, and then we've taken it further to do 6 months and 1 year. The check-ins really depend on the relationship that you've built and what is comfortable for the person that we're servicing. Next slide. So one of the greatest things that's coming out of this LEAD program is the successful collaborations that we've built. A lot of that has to do with relationships that I built prior to coming into the office. When people trust you and they trust your work, no matter what you bring to the table, they're ready to jump on it. I was able to go into previous police departments, previous other entities and say, hey, this is what I'm doing now. What do you think? And they were just like, okay. But not only did I talk to agencies and police departments, I went into the community, and I'm currently still in the community, asking them what they think will be best when it comes to OUD to make their community safe. So not only am I including the prosecutor's information, my fellow clinicians' information, the law enforcement, the expertise or experts when it comes to OUD, I'm considering what the community says they need. So that helps us build a program that they will participate in, refer somebody to. So we take them from the idea to the implementation, so their voice is heard from day one. And then again, all stakeholders, that means people who live in the community, people who commute to the community, people who have businesses in the community. Everybody is affected by what happens in the community. So it is very, very, very important to hear everybody from, again, idea to implementation. Next slide. Overcoming obstacles and gaining buy-in. The biggest thing is humanness. A lot of times when you're in your sphere, if you're an officer, if you have a family member that's been negatively affected by OUD or just a crime-ridden community, you focus on the crime and not the human aspect of the crime. So it's very important, and it has been important in several of my meetings to remind those that I'm speaking with that people are human, that they could be your brother, your sister, your aunt, your uncle, your cousin. I even shared my personal story with OUD with one of my daughters. That allows people to relax and just tap into their human side. I always remind people, you want to treat others like you want to be treated, regardless of whether they've allegedly committed a crime. They are somebody's mother, brother, uncle, sister, son, daughter. I always take time to address concerns. And even if I don't have the answer, I make sure that I get back with anyone who has a question that I cannot answer. That helps to build that relationship of trust and keeps the line of communications open. I also remind people it's just trial and error. A lot of times we think we know what's best, but it's not always what's best. So we have to be humble enough in our expertise to understand that sometimes what we say doesn't work. And when people see that you're able to say, my apologies, that didn't work, they're more likely to work with you because they know that you are open to change and being flexible. Verbiage matters. I say this all the time. There's a difference between saying criminal and client. There's a difference between saying criminal and participant. There's a difference between saying addict and person who suffers from OUD. So it is very, very important when you're gaining community buy-in, entity buy-in, police department buy-in, that you use the right verbiage and tags. Because if I continue to say criminal to you, that brings a negative connotation to what I'm doing versus saying my neighbor who happens to be suffering with opioid use disorder. That sounds better, and it makes me and others want to help more versus saying a criminal. And then again, always be truthful. You have to always be truthful about what you're doing, what your plans are, and how you plan to reach the goals. Because if you're not truthful, that damages your relationships. And as we all know, relationships are the basis for all successful partnerships or collaborations. Next slide. That was it for me.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to all of our speakers today. You all shared certainly a lot of good information for our folks on this call today. So now it is just after 2 o'clock, and I'd like to move into our question and answer portion. So this is opened up to all the participants to either go ahead and chat your questions into the chat box on the bottom right hand of your screen, or you can certainly take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask a question.
Ethan, I'd love to get started with a few questions that I had as I was listening to Kelly and Charlene. So for both of you, in thinking about how your programs were or are being implemented, what do you wish that prosecutors had known about prior to working with clinicians or mental health providers? And then on the flip side, what do you wish that clinicians had known about prosecutors? And I'm so grateful that we have both an attorney and a clinician on here to share kind of from those two different perspectives, because I think what you both bring to the table and what you both bring to the collaboration is important. But what do you wish the other had known before starting work with them?
This is Charlene. For me, I wish prosecutors would have known or grasped the concept that clinicians want justice too. We just look at it differently. We don't look at the law. We look at it through a perspective of equity and closing disparity gaps. But we want justice too. We just go about it a different way. Because I think here in the office that I'm serving in, they see us as those people who want to be soft on crime and not hold people accountable. But the process which we go through is all about accountability and equity and justice. We just do it differently and see it through a different lens.
Thank you so much.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Kelly.
Yeah, I was just kind of piggyback of what Charlene was saying. I think sometimes there's such a fear, especially in our office, and it's probably happened in other offices as well. Something goes wrong with someone who previously had a case in someone's office, and all of a sudden, it's in the news, it blows up, people get in trouble. And so there's a fear to divert in some cases. And so I think our clinician and our team was pretty good at realizing that and kind of soothing those fears and taking that in consideration. But that's something also that would be helpful at the onset, is kind of looking at the big picture. And we want to help the participants But we also have to ensure public safety and other things like that.
That's great. Thank you so much. And it looks like we actually have a question in the Q&A chat box, so I do want to make sure we're addressing this question. But so, for example, I guess in Kelly, in your program, how, or Charlene in yours as well, how will the clinician be protected when approaching an individual with a severe mental illness? So I know that the legal system wants to reduce the amount of excessive force utilized when bringing someone to justice, but ensuring that clinicians are protected. Is there a way to address that?
So I'll go. I think from our point of view, because we're getting a referral directly from a law enforcement officer, all of that has been, I won't say all, because there's always a chance, but those things have been considered. Our pass-off spots will always be in a place where there's some type of, or i.e. security. We're doing libraries, places in the community where people are comfortable and familiar, but yet still have a level of security for us. So that's one thing that we're doing to make sure that we stay safe in the midst of trying to help others be the best that they can be.
That's a great point, Charlene. I think you're pointing to a lot of things, that not only keeping people safe by talking about or meeting people in public spaces, but also meeting the client, like you said, where they are, so that the person, you're addressing those travel issues and the any income issues, that they're not able to have a car. You're really trying to meet the client where they are, but also respecting the clinician and law enforcement.
Yeah.
And Kelly, have you noticed if there's any issues in clinician well-being or safety in the court-based program?
Well, it's a lot different. So our clinicians, they're in the courtroom. So there's a deputy there, usually 2 in the courtroom. Because sometimes there are folks having a breakdown and it might come on suddenly. But I think it's a little less likely because there are several, like I said, there's a deputy in the courtroom, the judge is usually on the bench, and it's just a different environment.
That's a great point. And so we have a second question, and this question relates to kind of the number of clinicians. So coming from Matthew, I work in a very large prosecutor's office, over 1,000 employees. How many clinicians would realistically be needed to serve an office of this size? And I don't know if this is something that either, I know, Kelly, that LA City is a different office, and St. Louis is a specific office. So either of you could speak to how many clinicians relative to the size of your office would be great.
So in our office, we have 5 branches. And so we were able to get spread out. We were able to get more funding and get, for downtown, our biggest mental health hub, we have 4 commissions in the building, and as well as 4 case managers. In the other branches, we have 1 to 2 of each.
And for our program, since we're new and we haven't even actually started, but we'll kick off on August 31st, we have 3 clinicians currently. We have probably 80 or 90 prosecutors in the office, but we won't know if we need to scale up until we actually get going. I think if anybody is planning on bringing clinicians in an office, especially that large, I would probably, and this is Charlene's personal opinion, this has nothing to do with the prosecuting attorney's office, but I would say at least 7 to 10 in an office of 1,000 people or more. That's just the piloting phase to see what's needed.
Well, that's a great starting point. Thank you so much. So Matthew, I'm sure if you have follow-up questions, and maybe we can connect offline and really talk with your office and work through some of those considerations. The next question that we have that came in is, will the clinician and law enforcement be together when offering assistance to the individual? Is there a plan? And Charlene, I think this one maybe goes more to your lead program. Is there going to be the law enforcement clinician together offering assistance? If so, how will it happen?
So I'll say yes, because it starts off with the law enforcement officer referring. If they didn't feel the person needed the assistance or wanted the assistance, they would not refer. So that's where the collaboration starts. The officer is offering the lead program to whomever they come into contact with. I think one of the biggest things that I did not mention, where we've gotten buy-in from law enforcement, is that our program is considered successful if the person comes in within 48 hours and completes the entire biosocial cycle assessment. That is success right there. Officers have the opportunity to charge at that point if they want to. That's where another point of collaboration can come into play, simply because it may take one time, it may take 100 times for a person to get to the point to where they are abstaining, or whether they're just using in a more safe manner, or whether they're functioning. So we have 2 points where collaboration starts, or where collaboration happens: when the referral comes in, and at the point where the biopsychosocial assessment has been completed, we refer out. And if it has not been completed, then the officer and I, or one of our other case managers, can get together. Clinicians can gain more information about whom the officer brought in, and vice versa, and see if we can come together to do a better job for that person.
Thank you so much. And Kelly, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I heard you talking about was that the clinician gets the referral from the public defender. And so they're really meeting the clinician, they're meeting the client, excuse me, in outside the realm of law enforcement. And that's actually done on purpose.
Yes, we have a separate, so LAPD here, Los Angeles Police Department, they have mental health clinicians embedded in their stations, and they have a separate program where they try to reach out to people with mental illness. It's called the CAMP program, but they also stay separate, and they try not to be on the enforcement side as well, so that they're just reaching out to people, our homeless population who suffer from mental illness that are on the streets. They reach out to them and try to get them to accept services. And then once they have a lot of contacts, they try to forward that information on to us so that we can pull all their cases and also be able to argue to the judge that they do need mental health treatment as a part of their program. But yes, in the courtroom, they're getting their referrals directly from the defense attorney, and the defense attorney is speaking to them in court. I'm sorry, and the clinician is speaking to them in court.
Great, thank you. And I just want to highlight what I've heard from both of you at different times is that the way you define success is not someone comes in, gets treatment, and is cured. These are really long-term illnesses that require sometimes multiple contacts or just different approaches or different times of collaboration in their life. And so really defining what success means for a diversion program is important, because it doesn't mean that everyone is, I think what the hope is not always the reality that a person comes in, gets connected to services, and is cured of all problems, but really that understanding that it's a long-term process, that these mental illnesses are long-term, and that it may take a few times and a few collaborations. So being able to define what success looks like is very important.
I think that's extremely important, especially for people who are not familiar with mental illness. I know Charlene is very familiar. She's a clinician, or she works with people all the time who have mental illness. But for some of our cases, sometimes I've worked with prosecutors and they think, oh, well, they still have mental illness. And it's like, well, yeah, but our goal was to stop the criminal conduct. And that's what we did. You know, like, they're not going to not have their mental illness because of treatment. There'll still be, you know, issues and success. Like I said, sometimes they leave the program and they come back. To us, that's a success, especially for some cases where they have severe mental illness or severe drug addiction.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a conversation I had with a prosecutor who said that they reduced one individual's recidivism rate by 3 weeks. He went 3 weeks without getting arrested, and they viewed that as a major success for him.
Yeah.
Simply because of his illness, he was getting arrested almost, you know, on a very regular basis, and being able to just reduce that for everybody and for him really, and get that treatment was showing that there was an incremental increase in his treatment level, which was heartening for everyone. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's I'm sorry, Charlene, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just agreeing with what Rebecca was saying and what you were saying. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say we had a similar case, although the participant was still getting arrested. Our goal was to stop him from calling 911 when there was an emergency, and that stopped. So it's even sometimes you work on one issue at a time.
Mhm.
So yeah, that was similar to what you talked about, Rebecca.
Self-determination is very, very important in regards to diversion success. Again, from the outside looking in, we have all of these things that we want the people that we serve to accomplish, but it just may not be feasible for them. So listening and creating plans that are flexible so that they can grow with the client is so extremely important. And keeping the law enforcement side, the prosecutor, whoever may have arrested, abreast of the changes in the plan in case they run across that person again. Those, again, communication.
Well, Charlene, I thank you for that answer, because it brings us to the next question in our Q&A box, which speaks directly to that. Yvonne asks, you know, what do you think about having telehealth equipment in patrol vehicles to access mental health individuals instead of first directly bringing them to the hospital? And our law enforcement officers are now being trained on mental health at the point of training in the academy. So currently, it looks like their jurisdiction is currently looking into telehealth equipment. And could either of you speak to that equipment and that perspective?
I mean, that excites me as a clinician, because almost everything that occurs in our community that police are dealing with is anchored in trauma. And most of it is unrecognized and undiagnosed. So again, that is a tool that law enforcement can use to better assist the community, which again helps to bridge that gap and build trust, which eventually will increase public safety. I think that is like, my brain is over here going crazy. That is phenomenal. That's just another piece of this puzzle when it comes to officers being trained in crisis intervention. And once the mind frame from criminal to human being, or from criminal to maybe this person needs some better coping skills, huge strides can be made with these type of collaborations and partnerships.
I think that's a great point. So thank you so much. And I think it really speaks to the formal training necessary for all points, and really learning at each stage in the criminal justice process, making sure that everyone has the same language or the same resource to turn to, whether it's bringing them all together in the courtroom, like Kelly's program, or Yvonne, I really thank you so much for sharing what your jurisdiction is looking at, because if it's providing law enforcement officers with training on mental health and equipment like telehealth equipment, that's incredible. So I share in Charlene's excitement as well.
But I want to make another statement. So often we forget about, I think Kelly said something about this. Somebody said this, but our officers need telehealth for themselves. So if we weave in telehealth for those that are providing service, it'll be much easier for them to offer it to those who they are servicing.
I think that's a great point, and I think it goes to some of the, the vicarious trauma that we were talking about, that, prosecutors don't even recognize it themselves sometimes, or they don't recognize their burnout symptoms. But having that training and that recognition of trauma and the impact it can have on you, that is such an easy way for them to start recognizing it, especially in law enforcement as well. I think that's a great point, Charlene. And one piece that I really wanted to touch on before we conclude is trust. You both talked about trust being so important between you, the defenders, all parts of the team. And it really sounds like it was a long-term process for you all to get there in your jurisdictions. For someone starting out, where maybe that trust isn't built quite yet, what advice would you give them to reaching out to the judiciary, the defense team, the police department, the community? I know that's so many different moving pieces, but if someone's starting out and just doesn't know how to build that trust first, what's the first thing, what's the best advice you would share with them?
I think Charlene really touched on the building block for trust, and that's honesty. Making sure you're honest and upfront, not trying to hide evidence or anything from the defense, not misrepresenting to the court. And that goes with your reputation development. So I'm sure everyone keeps that in mind, but it's so very important to be open and honest when you're developing these programs. And also what helped with us as well, we would go to lunch and have our meeting at lunch versus just in a conference room or a conference room or other area, office area. We would actually go to lunch or have a little introductory icebreaker to get things going, and still in each activity being honest about things that you're working on and yourself.
I'm going to just say it over and over again: relationships. So often, when we need to collaborate or we need to partner, we go in talking about our project or our idea first. In order to build great relationships and great partnerships and collaborations, people have to know you first. So the first thing that anybody should do is just to let people know who you are, why you do what you do, and why you feel they are important to what you do. Once you establish that and you begin to build that relationship and nurture that relationship, again, people will trust you, whether it's an entity or that person in the community. They will trust you in whatever you bring to them. Even if they have questions, they will support you in what you're doing. So that is in the office, outside of the office, in the community, wherever. Those are the three things. Show people who you are, show them why you do what you do, and show them they're important to what you do. You can never go wrong.
And just one more thing is respecting what people have to say, respecting people while they're talking, acknowledging their concerns, and kind of like giving back what they're telling you so that they know you're listening, they know you're respecting what they're saying, and taking all perspectives into consideration. Like Rebecca said, there's different cultures already built in the different offices, different for judges, different for defense attorneys, different for clinicians. And you have to respect that culture and understand where they're coming from in order to build the relationships that Charlene is talking about.
Well, thank you both so much. I think that piece of just listening gets overlooked in a time where we have multiple computers and multiple phones, and there's caseloads are piling up and backlogs are piling up. And so really slowing down, I appreciate both of you saying that, and really just highlighting it, because I do think it's something that's so simple that anybody can do at any point in time. So I'll give one more pause for the chat, for the Q&A box, if anyone else has a question, as we're wrapping up here with our Q&A session. Not.
Yeah, Rebecca, I just wanted to touch on something
Go ahead.
before we move forward and certainly give some time for other last words as well. So I just wanted to go back and touch on some questions that were asked earlier about safety and protection around mental health professionals. And so I think what I want to make sure we communicate here today, because there is an issue with finding mental health professionals or mental health professionals being interested in working in criminal justice type settings. And so I think I want to be very clear that if in myself, having been an MSW and an LCSW working in clinical settings, when you're looking at occupational risk, if I'm deciding to be a mental health professional, whether I go and I work in an inpatient psych unit in a hospital, or I go and I work in a correctional facility or anywhere else, they actually have found that the rates of incidents around occupational risk are comparable. They're more the same. And so I think I want to make sure I communicate this message that it's not necessarily more dangerous. That's a misconception that mental health professionals working in correctional or criminal justice settings. And the other point I really wanted to make sure that we're not mixing this up is that when it comes to violence, what they've actually found is that people with mental illness are not any more or less likely to commit violence than people who are not mentally ill or have been identified as having a mental illness. So I just wanted to make those 2 points around with questions coming up around protection and safety, because I wouldn't want people to leave with mistaken beliefs, and we do need to encourage mental health professionals to work in these settings. There are hundreds of thousands of people with mental illness in our jails. So I think mental health professionals can certainly have a value. I will leave it at that. I don't want to have the last word. So if anyone does want to have some final words on that or an additional question, please feel free to speak up.
Ethan, I just want to thank you for bringing that up. Even though I ascribe to that, a lot of people do have a fear when it comes to being involved in this manner. So I thank you for bringing that information to the forefront of this conversation.
No problem. Any other final thoughts? We can go to the next slide, Andrea. So just some of the resources. This will be available on our CSG website within a couple weeks or so. There will be a recording. And we just want to say one final thank you to everyone of all of our panelists, speakers, and all of the participants today. Thank you all for coming. Here's our contact information. You can certainly feel free to reach out to myself or Rebecca regarding the presentation or anything else. Thank you all.